This is RiverTalks with Jonathan Brush, President and CEO of Unbound.
Well, welcome back to RiverTalks. We're in the middle of a bit of a short series here on what it means to thrive, particularly in the context of what it means for young adults moving into becoming full adults. And this is all connected to the point where I work for Unbound, and Unbound's mission is to train young adults to thrive. And so certainly, if you're interested in Unbound, that's fantastic. But we talk about these things because we think they're universal. We think that this is ultimately important for everybody to be able to learn how to thrive. And so in the previous episodes, we talked about what it means to thrive. We talked about the aspects of owning your purpose, having healthy relationships, owning your purpose, serving others, having healthy relationships. And in the most recent episode, talked about creating value. And in this episode, I want to talk about living resiliently in the real world. And I want to unpack that phrase a little bit. And so the first is to talk about what we mean by the real world. Often this can be a condescending term. Why don't you grow up and live in the real world? And it's this idea that the real world is full of struggle and harshness and all those kinds of things. Or we kind of use it to poke anybody's bubble that we think that they're having a happier than they should life. And they say, I wish you'd enter the real world. And I have some skepticism about that. In terms of, I have lots of people who for many years have said, I don't think you really live in the real world. You live in some sort of bubble or something like that. And I think we're all guilty of living in bubbles of some kind, that in so many ways we live in these echo chambers where we only hear the things that we want to hear. And it creates these kind of odd distortions of reality that it becomes a little difficult for people to understand what the real world is. But when we say real world here, we mean the world that actually exists and that is going to operate in such a way that is predictable. And I don't mean in some sort of prophetic way, like we know what's going to happen in the future, but in this sense that from a Christian point of view, when I talk about the real world, I talk about a real world that is fallen. And that means a couple of things. And the first thing is bad news, that it's fallen and it's full of sinful people. And so we're going to expect to find a broken, busted, fallen world where bad things happen and people do evil things, that evil exists and that we don't have an option, but that we are going to run up against it at some point. And I don't mean that to be a wildly depressing statement. I just mean that to be what I said it was, which is a view on reality. And I think that especially in the social media world, we follow a lot of people, we see a lot of people who curate their lives in such a way that only the successes are seen. And it creates this illusion that if we are just careful enough, if we just prioritize the right things, if we do the right things, that we follow the magic formula, that we can indeed live a life of constant happiness where nothing bad will intrude. And there is simply no scenario where that is ever going to be true. And if that sounds like a categorically broad statement, and if you listen to this podcast, you know that I'm generally pretty cautious about saying categorically broad statements. It is a broad statement, and I do mean it just the way I said it. I make a claim here that nobody gets out alive and nobody gets out without tragedy. All of us are going to be faced with hardship. We're going to be confronted by evil. We're going to have tragedy and crisis, and that tragic things are going to happen. And there are no exceptions, and that is reality for everybody. What is different today is that there is this growing illusion that we can somehow avoid those things. And what I think that does is it creates this deep fragility where people think they can avoid those things. And so when tragedies intrude, the results are catastrophic. And that the reaction to what past generations would have seen as sort of the everyday bumps and turmoil of life is instead seen as this disproportionately bad, catastrophic failure. And so that's worth paying attention to and understanding. And so what does it mean to then live resiliently? Well, resilience means understanding first that the world is fallen, and then secondly, that in this fallen world, there is hope. And so as a Christian, we consider that to be in the form of Christ who walked out of the tomb. And that means that this is a fallen world, and yet redemption is available. Redemption is available to us individually and on an ongoing daily basis, and that ultimately this world will be redeemed, that there will be an end to the story that is a happy ending. And so we live in the light of that hope. And so to live with resilience means to be able to do both of those things, or to understand both of those things. To understand on the one hand that we live in a fallen, broken world where there will be tragedy, and to live on the other hand with the hope of the redemption of this world. And that furthermore, that God redeems broken things. And so when you have a tragedy, there will be opportunities to redeem that pain. Now, it's important to be careful here. I don't mean in that, a bad thing will balance out with a good thing in some sort of weird karma fashion. I don't mean that at all. I merely mean that when tragic things happen, they are tragic and they are in and of themselves bad things. And there is suffering involved and there is pain and grief. And that pain and grief may not necessarily be balanced. And yet, living in a world where we are in hope also means that there will be an opportunity to redeem that, which means that there's something to learn from that. There's something that will instruct us going forward, and that we can deal with the pain and we can carry the grief, because ultimately we believe that pain and grief will be obliterated in the end. There will be a happy ending, that redemption is possible and is in fact at work in the world now, and that full redemption will come. So to thrive means to live resiliently in the real world, to embrace and understand that bad things happen, and that when that does, that is inevitable and not necessarily surprising, even though they're to be grieved and to be resisted, and that to be acknowledged as bad things. And that also we can live in this world with resilience, because we live understanding the tragedy, but also believing in the hope. And that when you merge those two things, instead of fragility, you get a deep toughness, if you will. You get this endurance, you get this strength. You in fact become resilient. And to thrive means to be able to live resiliently, to have resilience, to be able to live resiliently in the real world, where you fully understand both the problems and the hope and the promise.